Well, hello, fungi friends. It's been a while. This is Dr. Gordon Walker back for a second season of the Fascinated by Fungi podcast. So, I want to thank first and foremost my sponsor for this season. It is North Spore, my favorite mushroom company. They have a fantastic selection of grow kits and cultivation supplies and wellness products like uh, supplements made from whole fruiting bodies rather than mycelium grown on grain. And they also have an amazing culture bank. You can find all sorts of cool liquid cultures and slants and other materials on their website. They have sort of 3 pound grow kits with really easy to grow varieties like the yellow and the pink oyster and the blue oyster, as well as lion's mane. And they have some 5 pound kits of a little more exotic varieties, things that can be a little trickier to grow and cultivate at home, but are very much worth it. I've grown some awesome king trumpet mushrooms and namacos, and just love the variety of stuff that North Spore offers. And if you would like to order anything from North Spore, you can use my discount code Fascinated by Fungi in all caps to save 10% on your order. And I just want to thank you so much for listening and thank my sponsor, North Spore, for making this possible and cultivating a great relationship with me over the years. So I feel very comfortable in promoting their brand, their product, and saying with full certainty that I believe in what they're doing. And I met all the co-founders, and it's great people, great company. Just love what they're doing. So thanks again to North Spore for making this episode possible. And I just want to sort of welcome everyone back. It's been quite a while since I did a new episode, and I've gotten a lot of positive feedback from people about this podcast, and that's part of what motivated me to come back. I've been really busy the last couple of months working on the manuscript for my book, getting into doing the illustrations, the photos. It's been a really incredible journey, but also extremely challenging and really pushing the limits of what I knew and what I thought I was capable of. Certainly in terms of like focus and dedication and all this stuff. I am, as I've learned as an adult, maybe a little bit dyslexic and maybe a little ADHD. And so the prospect of sitting down and writing a book became very daunting and somewhat overwhelming at times. But I worked through most of it, and many thanks to my mom and my agent and my editor and the amazing team of people around me who I've gotten advice from. Big shout out to Mandy Quark and Alan Rockefeller and Damon Ty and Hart Singer, and conversations I've had with people like Lynn Boddy and Dave Hibbett and Andrew Weil, and just sort of run into so many people in the mushroom community who have given me good insights or advice or things like that. It's there's too many names for me to possibly mention. My acknowledgement section is going to be like a mile long, but I am nearing the finish line to some degree of getting some parts of the book done, and so I felt like I had a little bit more bandwidth to come back on and try to restart this podcast. And I don't know how often I'm going to do episodes. I may try for every 2 weeks or at least do one a month, something like that, but I'll try to not go such a long spell without giving you guys a new episode. And with that in mind, I want this to be a very sort of community-based thing where we're bringing ideas in and I'm addressing questions that exist for people. So it's not just me and following my fascination, which I will certainly do, but it's really exciting to me when there's things that people want to know, and that causes me to dive deeper and learn more on my own, which I then get to come back and share with you guys, filtered through the lens of my experience and the way that I assimilate information, which is, I think, what people like about what I do. So if you want to kind of actively participate in my community, I would invite you to join my Instagram broadcast channel. That's a place where I'll be putting a little more updates and polls and sharing thoughts and ideas about stuff. There's also my Discord. You can find the link for that in any of my social media links. Discord is a cool sort of chat community, and there's a bunch of threads within that where people can discuss various things from general thoughts to sharing cool mushrooms they found. There's a really lively discussion on cultivation. I just added a thread on entheogens, so if people want to have that kind of discussion, that's a place where we can have that discussion in a public forum, but maybe not so moderated by the sort of constraints of social media. There's places to share recipes and all sorts of stuff. The Discord has been a really fun community. And if you'd like to sort of follow me on some other platforms, please check me out on YouTube, on Facebook. If you want to support me directly, I do have a Patreon. Although, that's up to you. I don't like putting most of my content behind a paywall, so I put it all out there for free instead because I'm trying to make my mushroom education as equitable as possible and reach as many people as possible because that's kind of what's important to me. So that's my ethos, and I don't really want to create barriers for people to be able to see what I do, and so I'm putting it all out there. And I haven't put that much on my Patreon recently because I don't want there to be a paywall in between. I put a few recipes on there, and I'll probably do more of that because at some point I'm hoping to take my recipes and do a cookbook after I'm done with this sort of big overview reference book that I've been working on. But another request, if you guys have been listening to the podcast and you've enjoyed it, please go on your favorite podcast platform and review the podcast. It would be really great to get a few more reviews there on Apple, Spotify, Google, Callin, wherever you're listening to this podcast. Please drop a review. And I mean, if you have negative things to say whatever you want. But I would love some positive feedback because that helps more people find the podcast and then hopefully start learning about mushrooms and fungi along with me. So I want to sort of start by acknowledging that I am a PhD biochemist, but by no means am I an academic mycologist. And I think I've become a mycologist by getting into mushrooms and being excited about them. And I would like to say that anyone can be a mycologist as long as you're passionate, curious, and have a drive and desire to sort of learn about them. There is an amazing accessibility to this field that doesn't exist in other scientific disciplines, that you can get passionate about a mushroom, start studying them, and actively contribute to the field within like a couple of months of getting into the hobby in a way that you cannot do in other disciplines. And that is what's so exciting to me about mycology. That being said, there are academic mycologists who know tremendously more about this stuff than I do. A lot of people think that I'm an academic mycologist, and while I have a good background on yeast and fermentation and some of the microbial ecology that goes on with wine and beer fermentations, I'm still just really an enthusiastic amateur when it comes to fungi as a whole and specifically mushrooms too. So I want to acknowledge that I'm very much standing on the shoulders of giants when I talk to you guys, and there's so much I've learned from the community, from books, from media that's out there, and I'm hoping that what I do is a conduit and a sort of a passport. I'm handing people a way to get into the mushroom and fungal community and learn about this incredible segment of life that is sort of everywhere, but kind of hidden and kind of weird and just full of fascination for me. So, I mean, I can literally tell you when I say standing on the shoulder of giants, I mean my laptop is propped up on Mushrooms Demystified by David Aurora, The Fifth Kingdom by Bryce Kendrick, Mushrooms of the Redwood Coast by Noah Siegel and Christian Schwarz, and the 21st Century Guidebook by Moore Robinson and Trinchi. So literally much of the knowledge that I'm sharing with you guys is stuff that I've learned from reading and studying, and specifically this podcast, I'm hoping to cover some of the fungal lifestyles and ecology. And this is a little bit of a rehashing of episode 3 from the first season, where I talked about fungal taxonomy. And I have a slightly better conception of what taxonomy is at this point after having learned about it, but it's still really complicated. So I'm going to focus less on the taxonomic part of this. So I'm going to talk some about it, but not dive really deep, and try to focus a little bit more on like the lifestyles, types of ecologies, and types of interactions. And this is intentionally the first episode of this new season because I'm going to touch on a lot of things, but not go into a lot of depth. And I'm hoping that later in the season, I will take some of these concepts and dive in quite a bit deeper. But that's also based on the feedback you give me and what you guys want to hear from me. So I'm going to start out by saying that fungi are everywhere. Quite literally everywhere. We associate them with soil and with plants, and they're certainly there, but there's fungi in aquatic habitats, in water, and both like salt seawater as well as freshwater systems, as well as like bogs and marshes as well as sewage. They're in the deep ocean. There are fungi absolutely everywhere, and that's a lot of what we are still learning about, and whether or not it exists. For the most part, we have a pretty good idea about most mushrooms. There's still plenty that require a lot more in-depth study, but the sort of unknown frontier in a lot of ways for fungi is some of this aquatic stuff, some of these environmental things, some things that are like hiding out inside of algae and bugs and animals, and in places that we don't necessarily associate with fungi, including like extreme environments like the desert, like volcanic craters, like high salt environments, anywhere that we sort of associate with extremophiles, and we've normally said, well, this is in archaea or bacteria. Well, it turns out that fungi are there too. So they're literally everywhere on the planet, including in the air. There's fungal spores in pretty much every breath you take. They move around in the stratosphere. There's fungi that switch continents. There's fungi that live different life cycles on different plants and spread the spores all over the place. It is really wild how integrated into our entire world and our environment that fungi are. And that's, again, why I don't love the saying that mushrooms will save the world, because mushrooms already are the world. We're living in a fungal world, and it's only so lush and verdant because of the fungi. So what I'm trying to get people to do is like shift their mindset a little bit and be grateful and appreciative and thankful for the presence of fungi. And instead of being fearful, hoping that through education we can all learn a little bit more and become a little bit more open to our fungal friends instead of fearing them. So with that being said, sort of the 5 forms of fungi that I like to think about generally, and this is something that I'm borrowing from my book. There's sort of like unicellular fungi. So there are a lot of aquatic fungi, and they don't necessarily have to live in water. They can live in sort of like wet soils like bogs, marshes, anywhere like tropical rainforests, anywhere there's enough water for them to kind of get around. Because these are unicellular fungi, which can have sort of amoeba-like, which means they kind of like scoot themselves along by like stretching out and scooching along, or they can have like a flagellus. They have like an active tail, or like even like cilia-like things where they can kind of like crawl around lots of little hairs. And they're not always motile throughout their entire life cycle, but they're usually unicellular and often sort of associated with being like parasites of stuff. So aquatic parasitoids is one of the main forms. And then there are yeasts, which are also single-celled fungi. And there's both Ascomycete and Basidiomycete yeast, although it's more of a lifestyle to have like a single-celled thing. And some of those yeasts can become mushrooms or become filamentous fungi. So yeast is just one of their forms. In the realm of sort of what I think of as multicellular fungi, we have filamentous fungi, or what I call in the book sort of molds, things that are producing filamentous growth, but not necessarily producing a mushroom. And again, they do produce fruiting bodies, so they can make both asexual and sexual spores depending on their life cycle, but they're not producing like a large, distinctive fleshy mushroom, but they do have sporangia, or things that sort of spread spores. And where we draw the line there between mushroom versus sporangia gets a little dicey at some points, and mycologists will argue back and forth about like what really constitutes a mushroom. For me, I think there's sort of a difference there between like mushrooms versus molds, which is why I've delineated them a little bit, but they recognize that there's some gray area within there. Beyond filamentous fungi, there are filamentous fungi that also produce actual mushrooms, and so mushrooms are one of the 5 types. And then the last sort of lifestyle type that I'm going to think about and talk about are lichens. And lichens are this incredible symbiosis of the fungal body and sort of a photosynthetic partner. So it's the mycobionts, it's the fungal part, the photobiont, which is the algae or the cyanobacteria, and some lichens can even have both algae and cyanobacteria. Those tend to be in very extreme environments. And then on top of that, there's also this whole collection of different types of yeast and bacteria that live within the lichen that also make it sort of a whole organism and have to do with how the fungus becomes lichenized and takes on those photobionts. So there's a lot of complexity within this, even though those categories seem relatively simple, right? We have our aquatic parasitoids, we have our single-celled yeast, we have our filamentous fungi that form mushrooms, and then our lichens. So that's 5 sort of lifestyle forms that you'll see out there. There's estimated to be about 2 to about 5 million species of fungi, and with estimates up to about 10 million. And there's even one paper that estimates like 160 million, and that's including this genre of Mycosporidia and the idea that maybe for every single kind of insect, there's like an individual species of Mycosporidia, and so that's part of why that number is so incredibly variable. But I think like somewhere between the 2 to 5 million ranges is probably a pretty good number to assume that's maybe the total number of fungi that might be out there. And we've only characterized something like, I don't know, 5-10% of that total. So there's a tremendous amount of biodiversity left to be documented. But again, it's not necessarily that there's like a million more kinds of mushrooms we don't know about. There's a lot of these like microscopic fungi that we haven't yet identified or recognized that they're there, but they may be playing a bigger role in our world than we are actually aware of. And I'll talk about a few examples as I go through here of things that have had really big impacts, but may not necessarily be something that you know about or have heard about before. So fungi have been evolving for a long time. Eukaryotes arose about 20 or 2.2 billion years ago, and sort of the idea is that maybe a archaea cell swallowed a prokaryote bacteria cell, and that created eukaryotes. You know, plants split off maybe like 1.7, 1.5 million years ago, and then like animals and fungi split sort of 1.2, 1 billion years ago. So animals and fungi are a little bit closer than they are to plants, but there's still been like a billion years worth of evolution between them. So keep that in mind when we're thinking about fungi and animals. So to talk about this a little bit further, I'm going to say that, make a disclaimer. I'm going to try to say some of these science words, this taxonomic philo words, and give me a little bit of leeway with my pronunciation, because I'm not perfect and there's a lot of these words that I've never heard anyone say, so I don't know that I have the correct pronunciation, but I'm going to try to sound them out phonetically. And honestly, that's kind of the best you can do. Latin is a dead language, and in theory we should all be speaking Latin names as if we were Italian, and we're not, and I'm not going to do that. So I'm going to try to sound them out phonetically, but recognize that there may be someone, an academic mycologist, who might know how to pronounce this stuff a little bit better than me. And what I'm going to read you guys about here is based on stuff from a paper called Fungal Evolution, Diversity, Taxonomy, and Phylogeny of Fungi that was published in 2019 in Biological Reviews. There's another great paper that I also sort of draw from for this episode, and it's called Contemporaneous Radiations of Fungi and Plants Linked to Symbiosis. And that was a Nature Communications paper from 2020, I believe, Lazzoni et al. So those are two sort of academic papers that I dove in to try to figure some of the stuff out, and they have some cool figures and great charts, and I would highly recommend you at least go check out the figures in those papers, because the kind of graphical abstract type things that are in there may help you understand this a lot faster and more concisely than what I can actually put into words. I'm always a big fan of having pictures when I give presentations, and unfortunately in a podcast format, I don't have that luxury. So you're just going to have to take my word for it. Okay, so there's somewhere between about 8 to 20 phyla of fungi, depending on how you define them and what the taxonomic rank is. I fit those into sort of 3 main meta categories of fungi, and these are not real categories. These are sort of based on lifestyle and spores. So there are zoosporic fungi. So that's stuff like chytrids, which are the aquatic parasitoids, and those tend to have swimming spores, motile spores. So those are zoosporic fungi. There are zygomycetes fungi, which used to be part of Zygomycota, which is now a defunct taxa or phyla, and it's been split into a bunch of other ones, sort of Zupa mycota, Mercomycota, Glomeromycota, and these things can all be like teased apart or pushed together depending on whether you're a lumper or splitter, how you define some of this stuff. And then there's Dicaria, which is Ascomycetes and Basidiomycetes. So that's the ones that we really care about, because those are the ones that form mushrooms for the most part. But all 3 of these divisions, zoosporic, Zygomycetes, and Dicaria, have really important implications for fungi in our world, and they're present all over. So they're all sort of important to recognize. And there's 3 main kind of what are called ecological guilds, or sort of lifestyles for fungi, and there's a lot of lifestyles within this that I'll go into right after I go through the taxonomy. But there's saprotrophic, which means you're decaying dead stuff. And there's sort of like the symbiotic or parasitic types. And so there's some that can be like biotroph, which means they live on their host, or necrotroph, means they kill their host. And then there's like mutualistic parasitism or symbiosis, which examples would be like lichen or mycorrhizal fungi. And hang on, I'm not going to talk too much about mycorrhizae in this episode because I think the next episode I'll do would be a deep dive into mycorrhizal relationships. So I'm going to touch on them briefly here, but not go into a ton of depth. Okay, so thinking about the zoosporic fungi, these are sort of the earliest evolving form of fungi. They were generally parasitic, they lived in water, they could swim around. And so they look more like protozoans, like amoeba-like things, than a lot of what we think of fungi as being. And there is a whole sort of sister clade of fungi called Opistosporidia. And this includes Aphelidia, Rosalidia, and Mycosporidia. And again, take my pronunciations with a serious grain of salt. So these are, for the most part, not considered true fungi necessarily, partially because they lack consistent amounts of chitin in their cell wall. They may have some chitin like elsewhere in their cell. Some of them use cellulose in weird ways, which all makes them look like plants. And they all do phagocytosis, which means that instead of absorbing nutrients from their environment, they're actually actively like engulfing and eating their food. And so aphelids are usually algal parasites, and I don't know that much about them. There's Microsporidia, which are sort of commensal with animals and insects and part of maybe the mycobiome a lot of stuff. They have a extremely small genome in the world of fungi and no mitochondria, which is really interesting because they may have evolved before like mitochondria became part of the eukaryotic cell, or maybe they lost their mitochondria. Instead, they have these like mitosomes, which also make energy, but in a different mechanism. So Microsporidia are really interesting. And that's the one I said that like if every single insect has its own like Mycosporidia species, then that means there might be upwards of like 160 million species of fungi, which is mind-blowing. But, you know, depending on whether or not we define Mycosporidia as like true fungi, part of Eumycota, they're at least part of this sister lineage. And then there's the Roseliids or Cryptomycota, and they lack chitin in the cell wall. They do phagocytosis, and they prey on algae, and they're a mycoparasite and also an animal predator. So those are pretty wild things. Some of them like go after the little metazoan protist-like things, rotifers and euglena, and there's this whole microscopic world of fungi and other things in water there that are all interacting in really interesting ways. So there's potentially a huge number of species of that Opistosporidia, even though there's only 1,000 or more or something that have been characterized. There could well be millions that we don't know about. Then there are chytrids. So these are sort of the basal, what I think of as like the true basal fungi. So they do have chitin, and they are osmotrophic. So as opposed to the Opistosporidia, which kind of split off and are still part of like the fungal lineage at the very base, chytrids are what are considered true fungi because of the chitin and because they are osmotrophic. So a lot of chytrids, they're more common in like freshwater systems than saltwater, but they're present in both. They are generally saprotrophs in that they're digesting decaying material, often in swamps and bogs, in the deep ocean. A lot of the times they're doing it without oxygen, so they're working anaerobically, but they can also work aerobically. They're aquatic, like I said, but they can also be present in wet soils, so what they call pelagic soils, but in like, salt marshes and in tropical rainforests, anywhere you have a lot of moisture, chytrids can be pretty common. They feast on algae, they, parasitize small animals. They're generally saprotrophs, but they can have some of these other sort of roles as well. And the one that is probably the most impactful on like a global scale is this one called Batrachochytrium dendrobatus. Again, I'm doing my best to pronounce that. It's usually called BD for short. But it is a chytrid disease that has infected amphibians. and it's reduced like populations of amphibians by almost like half around the world. It's been really impactful for certain species of like frogs and salamanders and newts and like weird kinds of snakes and worms and things like that. And it's really sad because the idea is that this chytrid was probably taken from its native environment where maybe it didn't have that big of an effect and moved around through the illicit trading of animals and specifically um, amphibians, because frogs and newts and salamanders and stuff are like very popular with home collectors, and that has led to this massive die-off all around the planet. And there's some interesting things that are happening, like with the ecology of that there's like a certain kind of bacterium that can confer resistance to this chytrid, and if you infect the chytrids with the bacterium, then maybe they won't have such a big effect. And there's certain types of populations of frogs and stuff that are starting to show some innate immunity against the chytrid, but it's really had a massive effect, and it's certainly something that we can point to human activity as being the reason why so many of these amphibians have gone some of them may have gone extinct, but it's certainly a massive reduction in their population levels, which is not good for our ecosystems and not good for the robustness of species or diversity of the gene pool. So that's one way in which chytrids have had a really big effect on our world. And chytrids are able to grow what are called rhizoids. So they're usually sort of single-celled, but they can produce some filamentous type growth when they're inside of, or they like latch onto the outside and then grow rhizoids into something. And that's part of how they do the saprotrophy, where they start digesting stuff and they're using the rhizoids as a way of taking up nutrients from their environment in the same way that like filamentous fungi do. Though as far as I know, chytrids are usually still single-celled, even though they grow these sort of like pseudo-hyphae rhizoid things. They exhibit some really wild forms of reproduction and alternating between like asexual and sexual cycles and having different sized spores. And sometimes they can produce so many spores they burst their host cell open, or they like poke a hole and the spores swim out. There's a lot of different ways they do it. And I think we'll do an episode on sex and fungi, and I think chytrids have some of the most bizarre kind of like mating habits. Then there's a class of chytrid-like things. So these are technically now different phyla from chytrid mycota. And this one's a mouthful, but it's a Neocalomastogomycota. So these are saprotrophic, anaerobic saprotrophs that live in the guts of ruminant animals and some birds and some reptiles. And they seem to have the ability to digest xylanase, or xylate is a sugar, produce these enzymes that can break down xylose. And it looks like that was a horizontal gene transfer from bacteria, which is pretty interesting because fungi are sometimes evolving in a non-linear fashion where they're just like picking up pieces of DNA or from other organisms and going, yeah, this looks useful, I'll add this to my toolkit. And so this entire phyla of fungi have become evolved relatively recently in this sort of like obligate mutualistic symbiosis with animals, and are really important for the way that ruminants do digestion and stuff like that. So I think that's pretty cool. There's still not that many known, and so there may be more of them than we have recognized, because they might actually be more common and we just haven't been looking in the stomachs of animals for fungi, but they might be there. And then there's a Blastocladiomycota. Those are saprotrophs, but also parasites. They're parasites on algae, plants, animals, and even humans. They can cause some pretty serious diseases in humans. So that's all sort of like zoosporic fungi. We have zygomycetes fungi. So these are things that don't have flagella. They're usually in soil. They form filaments, hyphae. They do have chitin, and they are osmotrophic. So the sort of bigger category of these things is called Zupagomycota, and that encompasses several different distinct phyla that are really diverse and don't necessarily have like general characteristics in common, but they're usually saprotrophic. They can be invertebrate parasites and mycoparasites on other fungi, and even parasites and pathogens on metazoans and amoebas. So that's one kind. There are Mercomycota. So these are mostly filamentous saprotrophs, something like rhizopus, which is a common black bread mold. It's also what they use to make tempeh. So you take some leftover soy hulls and infect it with rhizopus, and it grows a mycelium through it, and then you can like cook and eat that tempeh. It's also being used in biotechnology, all sorts of stuff. So the Myrcomycota includes things that are usually sort of like fast moving. They suck up sugars and molds that grow quickly and are pretty competitive. But they can be like mycoparasites. They can cause diseases in humans. There's one sort of subsect of them called endogonales that attract. They grow on like rodent poop and then produce this sort of like aroma that makes rodents come want to eat the poop. And so they're continuing like their life cycle by like sort of controlling the brains of animals, which is kind of a wild thing to think about, that fungi can do that. And then there's a Glomeromycota, which is now technically genetically part of the Myrcomycota phyla. It used to be its own, but it's filamentous fungi that are obligate biotrophic associates with the roots of plants, and arbuscular mycorrhizae are these kinds of endomycorrhizal associations, and they are very common. Upwards like 80-90% of plants have arbuscular mycorrhizae, and I'll go more into what that means in my episode about mycorrhizal relationships, but they're really important for soil, and they're super common all over the place. And zoosporic, there's probably 1,400 known species, and zygomycetes fungi, there's probably 1,500 known species. So there's a lot of possibly unknown species variation within those two categories of fungi, and we're going to learn a lot more over the next several years as we do more environmental testing and DNA sequencing becomes cheaper and cheaper, which is pretty cool to see. And then in Dicaria, we have the two phyla we care the most about, Ascomycetes and Basidiomycetes. And so the book Hidden Kingdom of Fungi by Keith Seifert, he lays out a scheme that I use in my book, and it's also sort of used in Britt Bunyard's book, The Lives of Fungi, where it's the A, B, C's, and Z's of fungi. So the A's are the Ascos, B's are the Basidios, C's are the chytrids and chytrid-like fungi, and the Z's are these sort of zygomycetes fungi that are filamentous and live in soil. So I'm going to be referring to the A, B, C's, and Z's of fungi throughout this podcast season, and hopefully this episode is one that helps you kind of cement some of your understanding about this whole thing. So Ascomycetes are very varied and wild. There's probably maybe 93,000-ish known kinds of Ascomycetes, and there's sort of three main categories of them. There's Taphyrno Mycotina, and that includes fission yeast, Schizosaccharomyces pombe, fission yeast, and those are used in biotechnology a lot. There's one weird mushroom that evolved in that category too called Neolecta. It's kind of this weird yellow earth tongue looking thing, but it evolved completely separately from all the other mushrooms that exist, so that makes it pretty cool. There's Saccharomycotina, which includes Saccharomyces cerevisiae, budding yeasts. Those are usually saprotrophs, but they can live as endophytes, and there's even some Saccharomyces that live in our guts and can have positive impacts on human health. And then there's Pizizomycotina, and that includes majority of the kind of really cool stuff in the Ascomycete phyla. Pesiales is going to include most of the morels and truffles. Sortiomycetes includes Xylaria and cordyceps. Lichanomycetes includes a lot of the lichens. There's several other divisions, or Orbilomycetes and things like that cover more the weird little cup fungi and other sort of cryptic hidden forms of Ascomycete life. In the Basidio phyla, there are sort of three main divisions. There's Agaricomycotina, and that is pretty much all mushrooms. There's Punctinio-mycotina, which is all of the rusts, and then there's Eustolagomycotina, and that's all of the smuts. And there's some other little sort of phyla things in there as well, but that's covering majority of what's in there. And there's probably something like maybe 50,000 Basidiomycetes. So there's a lot of diversity here of all the different kinds of fungi, and I'm probably not doing it true justice, but I'm just trying to kind of cover it all. So we're gonna dive into the different fungal lifestyles now. I talked about the forms, so aquatic parasitoids, yeasts, filamentous fungi, molds, mushrooms, and lichens. And within those 5 forms, they can live a lot of these different lifestyles. And there's a thing in fungi where a whole organism is called a holoorganism. or holomorph, I guess. And then within that, it encompasses both an asexual and a sexual form. So the sexual form is called a teleomorph. That's usually what produces like a mushroom. And there's an anamorphic form, which can be a little more like weird and cryptic and strange. And for a lot of like fungal history, teleomorphs and anamorphs were defined as different organisms. And they called anamorphic fungi imperfect or deuteromycota because they couldn't get them to mate or produce offspring in a lab. And we've now realized through the advent of DNA sequencing that they're actually all related, and we're having to reclassify a lot of different things as being similar or different depending on their DNA sequences. I talked earlier too about the sort of spectrum there of like mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism in terms of how fungi are interacting as in symbioses with their environment, and recognize that as I go through these different kind of lifestyles, that fungi between their anamorphic and teleomorphic forms and depending on the other organisms in their environment can vacillate wildly on a spectrum from mutualistic to parasitic in terms of how they're interacting with the organisms around them, right? So there are saprotrophs, which are used to be called saprophytes, but that is a now defunct term because it implies that mushrooms or fungi are plants, which they are not. So the more correct term is a saprotroph or a saprobe. And this is things that are going to digest cellulose, chitin, lignin, even keratin. It's not super common for fungi to digest keratin, but there are some specialized kinds that can do that. So that's stuff that can grow on like horns or feathers or hair. Again, not a common thing for fungi, but it can happen. And then they also have the capacity to digest like fats and lipids and proteins, and fungi can really break down a huge variety of stuff. So there tends to be sort of aerobic fungi, ones that use oxygen. There's things like the rhizopus that really quickly consume sugars. There are some xylaria and endophytic fungi that come out, and right after a plant has died, they eat a lot of the available sugars. There's stuff like white rot fungi that produce lignases and are able to break down lignin. So wood is a composite of cellulose fibers that all run parallel, cross-linked by these big chunky lignin molecules, which are really difficult to break down. And white rot fungi have produced these specialized enzymes that can break down the lignase or lignin in the wood and leave it kind of shredded and stringy. That's white rot, just leaves it like that. And then there's brown rot, which white rot are a little more common in cool northern habitats and on slight preference for hardwoods, whereas brown rot is a little more common in like warm, exposed conifer habitats. And the brown rot fungi are using the power of hydrogen peroxide and peroxidases to break down the cellulose, and they leave wood with what's called cube rot. So you have sort of more square pieces left over. Then there's a bunch of ascomycete fungi that can cause sort of soft rot. There's also like composting fungi that digest sort of more digested substrates. Agaricus bisporus is a classic composter thing. There's sort of bluets. Bluets are another like composting fungi that also like harvest nitrogen from the bacteria. There's a lot of shades of differences here, and it's not the clear delineations kind of break down when you start looking very specifically at some of these lifestyles. I'm just trying to kind of give you guys a broad overview. There's coprophilous fungi, which are dung specialists. So those are ones that will sort of be inside of plants or on plants, and they grow up and produce mushrooms in the dung and then try to disperse spores like away from the dung. There's one called Pelobus, the hat thrower, that grows in cow poop and then sort of jettisons its spores like up to like 10, 20 feet away so that it's no longer near the poop, because cows won't come eat poop. They want to eat clean grass. And so the spores get away from the poop so that they'll get consumed and they feature by the cows and continue their life cycle. There's a lot of little interesting Zygomycetes and ascomycete fungi that are coprophilous, and there's also plenty of Basidiomycetes too. Psilocybe is famous for growing on cow poop, and there's I think a bunch of various types of ink caps and brittle stems and other things that'll grow on dung. And then there's the anaerobic. There's the aerobic and then the anaerobic digesters. So I talked about like the aquatic things and the neocalo whatever mycota things that can grow in the stomachs of ruminants. There's also some sort of really like wild things called endolithic fungi. And so these are fungi that can live like literally inside of rock and inside mineral deposits and are able to like produce their own energy by just kind of sucking like the bare minimum out of like the rock or the minerals that they're in. And these are also like responsible for over long ecological epochs, the breakdown of rock into soil, and were possibly some like early forms of life that helped the planet kind of terraform from being a lifeless rock into the lush verdant world we have today. There's also those endolithic fungi have been implicated in the health of coral reefs, and there's a certain Aspergillus species that is aquatic and is a parasite of coral reefs. And I learned about that from Britt Bunyard's Secret Lives of Fungi, and it just was absolutely sort of mind blowing that that's a thing, and made me want to like look deeper into learning more about aquatic fungi and what role they play in those aquatic ecosystems. But those endolithic fungi are absolutely wild, and some of the sort of most sort of bizarre forms of life you can think of, because they don't match up with what we think of life as being, and they grow insanely slowly. They live a really long time. They can like literally live inside of rock, and it's just cool. And then there's like lithotrophic fungi. So there's fungi that are able to grow. We normally think of fungi as digesting organic matter, particularly being really good at digesting carbon. But there's lithotrophic fungi that can grow on like non-organic sources. So there's radiotrophic fungi that can grow on the radiation produced in a place like Chernobyl, and they're able to use melanin, this like protective pigment, to kind of convert that radiation energy into like chemoosmotic energy that they can use to grow cells. And they are able to resist some of that by just having ridiculous DNA repair systems. Then there's like plastic degraders. There's a huge amount of fungi that can digest plastics and potentially make energy off the breakdown of those bonds. And the problem is that a lot of those plastic digesting fungi don't necessarily digest plastic down to its fully decomposable units. They just break them down into smaller microplastics. So the fact that there's so many fungi that can eat plastics may not necessarily be the best thing. And we should be somewhat, I think, worried that there's so many fungi that are showing the capacity to break down plastics. As we put so much plastic into our environment, now the fungi are just helping to produce more microplastics by accelerating the breakdown rate of some of those plastics. So we need to look at not necessarily trying to bioremediate the plastic, but remove the plastic from the environment and then put it in specialized types of digesters, where maybe we use fungi as part of a multi-step process to take that plastic back down into something that is actually bioavailable, and not just like toxic microplastics are in our environment. So those are sort of like the decayers, the saprotrophic stuff. And then there are symbionts, or parasites. And I mentioned earlier there's biotrophic and necrotrophic parasites. So biotrophs are ones that live on sort of a living organism, usually without killing it. And a necrotroph is something that sort of ultimately ends up killing its host, which is not necessarily always advantageous. Over a long period of time, it may actually be better to keep your host alive rather than kill it. And so what we've seen is a lot of things. Fungal basal lineages were often necrotrophic parasites, but over long evolutionary time, they've become biotrophic because it's actually a better strategy to sort of live on your host and potentially even become mutualistic with your host rather than being like a pure parasite. So there's a real spectrum there of like mutualistic, altruistic kind of associations to commensal things, where like maybe one is benefiting, the other one isn't. Or they're just, both of them are existing in the same space but not really helping or hurting each other in any particular way, to things that can then become more parasitic or pathogenic. And one organism can vacillate between those different states depending on nutrient conditions, environmental conditions, what other organisms are present. And a great example of that is like the human mycobiome, because humans have fungi. We have it on our skin, we have it in our GI tract, we have it all over our genitals, we have fungi in our lungs. And many of those things can be sort of commensalist or maybe even marginally mutualistic in that they're helping, like Candida yeast can help to prevent invasion of other pathogenic fungi, and they tend to hang out at the entrances to our orifices. But if Candida yeasts get a little unbalanced and they have an opportunity, they can become pathogenic and cause like inflammation and yeast infections and stuff like that. But generally, they can be helpful. Same with like the yeast on our skin. Is usually they're sort of there, maybe outcompeting other organisms that might be more helpful or more harmful. But they can also go into a mode where they're causing disease or causing some other issues, like the sort of Tinea versicolor is a product of your dandruff yeast on your skin kind of getting out of control and causing like pigment bleaching in your skin. So in the realm of the symbionts and parasites, the one I like to sort of think of as the original would be lichenized fungi. And lichenized fungi have evolved like multiple times throughout evolutionary history. They probably showed up maybe about 4 million years or 400 million years ago and probably precede the advent of mushrooms. Lichen was probably first. And it is the combination of a mycobiont, the fungal base, an algae or cyanobacteria, which are the photobiont. And then there's this whole conglomeration of like yeasts and bacteria in there that help to mediate those interactions between the myco and the photobiont. And lichens are 98% of lichens or so are ascomycetes in the lichanomycetes and lichanomycetes, something or other categories. And so most lichens look more like ascomycetes, and they produce these little cups as their fruiting bodies. But there are some basidiolichens that basically produce mushrooms as their teleomorphic sexual stage, and I think that's really cool. There may even be like a psychotrophic lichen down in the Amazon, and that's still kind of up for debate as to whether or not there could be psilocybin or other psychoactive chemicals in that lichen. But it was part of some traditional practices for certain Amazon tribes. So lichens are just wild, really cool things. I'll definitely do a whole episode on lichens later. There's endophytic fungi. So these are fungi that are living inside of plant tissue and acting as sort of part of the microbiome of the plant. So often a lot of anamorphic ascomycete stages are living inside of plants as endophytes. It's been sort of theorized that the majority of like morels and morchella species are actually endophytes in their anamorphic form. And that's how they associate with their host tree. So instead of being like truly mycorrhizal, they're living inside of the tree and forming like a big sclerotia on the base and then producing that mycelial mat. Go check out episode 15 from last season for my sort of thoughts on morels. But endophytes are really, really cool. And if I could go back and do a second PhD, I'd probably go study endophytes, because they can also, in conjunction with other bacteria and fungi inside of a plant, completely change sort of the programming and the appearance, the growth conditions, the pest resistance. You can modulate a lot of things in plants by changing the endophytic fungi and bacteria inside of them, and the interactions between those things as it relates to the endophytes produces a lot of secondary metabolites which can mediate ecological interactions and deter predation and do all sorts of stuff for the plant. So it's a way that we can kind of mess around with like plant biology by recognizing like the holoorganism and then like components of that holoorganism, how we can switch them up and how that changes interactions. There's also epiphytic fungi, the fungi that live on the surface of the plants, and similar in that they can be pathogenic, but they may also be serving like a more commensal or mutualistic role by outcompeting the presence of other fungi that might end up being more pathogenic. So you have fungi inside of plants and on top of plants, and both of those are really important when we come to think about like animals and insects that eat plants, and how some of those things go from being like a plant parasite to suddenly being like an insect parasite, and how it might be like anamorphic in a plant, but then like go through its sexual stage inside of an insect. So that's pretty cool. And that gets also at the idea of entomopathogens, because there's a whole section of fungi that are parasitic on insects, and sometimes those insects get infected because they're like down in the soil and their larvae is in the soil and a spore hits them. But sometimes those insects are actively predating plants, and the fungi is hiding out inside the plant and then infecting the insect. And this is one of the things we've looked at with like biocontrols, to look at spraying a field of crops with, instead of fungicides or pesticides, we're going to spray them with the spores of a fungus that when the insects eat the plant, they get infected with the fungus, and then that knocks them back instead of having to spray a bunch of chemicals in the environment. And so it's more specific to the pest rather than killing like the whole biome. And that whole concept of sort of biocontrols and biobetters is really neat. I hope to like address that a little bit more. Um, so there's mycorrhizal fungi. And again, I'll do a whole episode on this, but I'll sort of say that there's ectomycorrhizal, ones that do not penetrate the plant cell and kind of create a sheath around the root. And then there's endomycorrhizal, which do go inside of the plant cell and form little arbuscules for nutrient exchange. And we'll do a lot more of that on the next episode. There are plant pathogens, stuff like rusts, which have these really complicated, like multi-plant life cycles. White pine blister rust is a really important one. Rust has had a huge impact on like the coffee industry, banana industry, all sorts of gnarly stuff are caused by rusts. There's smuts, which are distinct from rusts. They have a slightly less complicated reproductive cycle. But the sort of most famous one is Huitlacoche eustulago matus, that forms like big fleshy galls on corn cobs and is pretty darn tasty if you eat it. You got to cook it, but it's very nice. And there's a whole bunch of other like plant pathogens, chestnut blight and ash dieback disease, other little kinds of like swimmy fungi that cause major diseases in plants. We'll do an episode on plant pathogenic fungi. And so those are some of the things I think of sort of as like biotrophs generally, in that they're like their host is still alive. The rusts and smuts don't usually like kill their host; they just sort of impact part of the fruiting body or something like that. And then there's like necrotrophic things. So there are, and again, these categories there's back and forth on both of them. But the necrotrophs I think of are like the amoeboparasites and the things that attack metazoans. So they're living inside of or like attacking little amoeba-like things and euglena things. There are kinds of fungi that actually prey on slime molds, which are protists or amoeba-like organisms. There's mycoparasites like Hypomyces lactiflorum, which is an ascomycete mold that colonizes the outside of basidiomycete mushroom and kind of castrates it and produces a bunch of ascospores to go back into the soil and then reproduce next time they get to infect a mushroom. And there's a whole bunch of different kinds of Hypomyces. Some are specific to Lactarius and Rusula, some are specific to boletes. There are also zygomycetes mycoparasites. There's a tremendous number of mycoparasites of fungi that prey on each other because of their ability to digest chitin. There's stuff like powder caps, Asterophora, which grow on like rotten out black decaying russulas, and those are really cool. Those are basidiomycetes. There's shrimp of the woods, Entoloma abortivum, which is like an entoloma and an armillaria that kind of like get into arms race and create these big fleshy galls. That's also basidiomycete. There's like a whole bunch of different kinds of parasitic boletes and the interactions between like Gomphidius and Crugomphus that parasitize the mycelium of Pseuilus, as well as even like the scleroderma, which is in the Boletaceae, and there's a parasitic bolete that grows on earth balls, and earth balls themselves are toxic, but like the parasitic bolete you can eat, and that's pretty cool. There are lots of like micro animal parasites, so like stuff that prey on tiny like rotifers and tardigrades and nematodes and all these sort of microscopic animal worm planktonic-y things, whether that's in the ocean or in soils or in bogs. It just happens everywhere. Fungal are part of the ecology of all these different places. There's algal parasites that prey on diatoms, again in marine habitats and also like terrestrial habitats. I mentioned entomopathogens, but there's like the ascomycete hypocreales, which create cordyceps, Ophiocordyceps, like you guys heard about in Last of Us. There's Tolipocladium, which is a cordyceps-like fungus that can infect both like truffle things and also scarab beetles. And we've gotten like a really important molecule called cyclosporin from Tolipocladium, which is important as an immune suppressor. So if you know anyone who's an organ transplant, they probably take cyclosporin. There's Beauvaria, which is like white muscadine fly fungus, and it's sort of this generalist entomopathogen that just turns flies and a lot of other insects to little fuzzy white things. But it turns out that Beauvaria is usually an anamorphic form of, its teleomorphic form is actually often forms cordyceps. So in its generalist anamorph form, it infects lots of different insects. And then a certain Beauvaria species, when it goes into its like sexual phase, may be very specific to one insect as an actual Informia cordyceps mushroom, when the rest of the time Beauvaria forms sort of just like a white fuzz. So I think that kind of thing is super cool. There's Lobiliomycetes, I think, what are called beetle hangers. They're just like kind of like a little fungal STD that like a lot of different kind of beetles get and then transfer to each other. Super microscopic, but really interesting. There's different kinds of zygomycetes entomopathogens. So there's stuff like Massospora, which I've talked about before, I think on like the creepy fungi episode, but it is a fungus that infects cicadas specifically, and both like the periodic as well as like the annual cicadas, and it essentially causes their butt to rot off and turn into a giant powdery mass of spores. And this is one that injects the brains of the cicadas with psychoactive chemicals like cathinone, which is sort of like methamphetamine, or like psilocybin, and causes them to like change their behavior and do sorts of weird dances to attract a mate. And there's this like double set of life cycles that it goes through. There's the zombie fly fungus, Entomopathora, which is sort of similar, that creates little like white mold and causes summit disease, where the fly will like climb up something and then like spill spores all over the place. So there's a huge variety of these lifestyles and just absolutely stunning diversity. And when we get into each one of these things, like how many different kinds of fungi from different taxonomic backgrounds have arrived at doing similar forms of life and the way they get after things. And then there's like predatory fungi and sort of microanimal parasites I talked about, but there's the Nemophagous fungi, the ones that attack and eat nematodes. So a lot of white rot fungi like oyster mushrooms and wine caps have capacity to trap nematodes, and there's like several different mechanisms. They can make like a little loop or lasso that the nematode swims through, and it constricts and sucks the nitrogen out. And then be sort of like a mesh or like a net thing that's kind of sticky, and the nematodes get stuck in that. And there's even sometimes that produce like poisonous droplets, so the nematode like hits the droplet, gets like stunned, and then the mycelium like takes its time to like suck the stuff out. And then there's also a lot of those like zoosporic fungi that will actively like hunt other micro animal parasite things by like shooting them with like a little harpoon. Their spores like a harpoon, it shoots in and then starts growing like mycelium inside of it. So it's just an absolutely mind-blowing number of lifestyles and ways that fungi go about their business. And I hope that this is a good overview, but quite honestly, I'm sure I missed a whole bunch of interesting things that fungi do. And, you're going to have to get my book eventually when it comes out, as I try to summarize and make sense of a lot of this stuff. And what I told you guys here is a product of me having like thought about this almost every day for the past 2 years. And I still think I barely understand it. And as I said, there's probably some academic mycologists out there who know this stuff much better than me. But it's been a real joy, as well as a real challenge, to try to go through this and like make sense of things and learn them. And as I spit them back to you guys, I realize that like I don't know anywhere near as much as I thought I did, and I still have so much left to learn. But that's part of why I find this whole journey so fascinating and exciting, because I'm compelled to keep learning more, and hopefully you guys are too. So thank you very much for tuning in. Thanks again to Northspore. I highly recommend checking out northspore.com. They regularly have different deals and packages, and updated resources in terms of learning, and cool little featurettes they make. Northspore is an incredible resource that I highly recommend. And if you use the discount code FascinatedByFungi in all caps, you can save yourself 10% on your order. I'm really looking forward to a bunch of logs in the backyard that I inoculated with Northspore plug spawn, and I've got lion's mane, shiitake, oyster mushrooms, and chestnut mushrooms. And hopefully this fall, fingers crossed, I will get some mushrooms growing out of my logs. This is my first time doing like large-scale log cultivation, and pretty excited because I've mostly done just either like straw and kitty beds or in my garden beds or just kits, but I'm trying to kind of up my cultivation game, and Northspore is definitely helping. I'm also hoping at some point to do like a monotub grow and just try out all the different ways of growing mushrooms at home, because it's really fun and exciting. And Northspore I think is sort of the best resource for me, at least, to get mushroom stuff. So thanks again to them sponsoring this episode. And I think next time I am going to try to do a deep dive into mycelium, the types of mycelium, the kinds of interactions they have, how they like sink carbon, and also go into some of the thoughts on like what's called the common mycelial network, or the idea of this wood wide web, and sort of a critical take on this concept that like mycelium is all like sharing nutrients and everything's part of this like big buffering network. And the truth may be that there's more competition out there in nature than we really truly give it credit for. But I will be reviewing that and talking about that with you guys. And thanks for tuning in, and I wish you all the best. Much love to everyone out there. Thank you once again. Bye bye.